President Trump and his trade advisor have accused India for directly supporting Russia's geopolitical ambitions through its oil imports, and have gone on to criticize Prime Minister Modi's cooperation with Putin and Xi Jinping at the SEO summit, calling it detrimental to U.S. interests. How do these accusations in fact now fit into the ongoing trade talks between the two nations? And is Donald Trump jeopardizing 25-year-old carefully crafted relations between the two democracies, something that former NSA Jake Sullivan spoke about?
Well, I think there's no question that President Trump has done a great deal of damage to U.S.-Indian relations. What's quite paradoxical here is that in his first term as president, he did a lot to improve U.S.-Indian relations. And at the beginning of his second term earlier this year, when Prime Minister Modi visited the White House, it looked like U.S.-Indian relations were just going to get even better. But in recent months, what has happened is that President Trump has taken a number of measures that have basically sabotaged those relations, and the United States and India are at loggerheads today.
Given the Trump administration's framing of the U.S.-India trade relationship as a totally one-sided disaster, and Donald Trump himself took to Truth Social to say so, and the subsequent steep tariffs, to what extent do you see this economic conflict reflecting an underlying power struggle consistent with your own thesis that great powers seek to limit peer competitors' rise?
Well, I don't think the United States is interested in preventing the rise of India. In fact, I think the United States has a vested interest in seeing India grow more powerful, just like it has a vested interest in seeing good relations between the United States and India. And this is in large part due to the fact that the United States considers China to be its principal adversary, and it has a deep-seated interest in having a powerful India help to check China's ambitious agenda in Asia. So from a strategic point of view, the United States has a powerful set of incentives to work with India to help make India more powerful. With regard to the economic relations, there's no question, I think most Indians recognize this, that there were economic problems that had to be fixed. And India was going to have to make some concessions. And people were talking about this in the spring and last winter of this year. So people recognize the economic problem that exists, the trade imbalance, for example, certain Indian tariffs that were bothering the Americans. But it looked like the Indians and the Americans were going to be able to work out a deal.
Okay.
These were not insurmountable problems. What I'm saying is that the economic problems, which were clearly there, were not insurmountable. But what happened is other political considerations got in the way, starting with Trump's claim that he settled the India-Pakistan conflict in the spring of this year, and then the whole issue of sanctions because India was continuing to import Russian oil. So that economic problem that could have been solved has not been solved, but not because of the economic problems per se, but because of subsequent political problems that arose.
Okay, Professor Mearsheimer, considering accusations that the U.S. tariff policy under Trump was influenced by personal and political agendas, and as you said, the ceasefire claims by Donald Trump himself, how should, do you think it's domestic politics in great powers which actually tends to distort or complicate the power struggles and negotiations, especially in the context of what is an evolving situation, an evolving U.S.-India trade deal, and particularly about the strategic relationship as well in the backdrop of the SEO summit?
Well, I actually don't see domestic politics mattering much in terms of U.S. India relations. I think most Americans have very positive attitudes towards Indians. Uh, there are lots of Indians who live in the United States who are on college campuses, and they're highly regarded, highly respected. So I don't see any domestic agenda at play here in the United States. I think one could argue that the economic problems that we discussed before mattered somewhat from a domestic point of view. But again, those problems were surmountable. I think the real problem here has to do with Trump's personality and the fact that he had to brag that he settled the India Pakistan crisis and that he deserved a Nobel Prize and that he was greatly appreciative of Pakistan for nominating him for a Nobel Prize and hoped that India would do the same. Those sorts of things started to poison the relationship between India and the United States in the spring. And then you have the geopolitical issue of India importing Russian oil, really complicating matters. But I don't see domestic politics as an issue here.
Okay, Professor Mearsheimer, just a couple of more questions here, sir. Do you think that the Trump administration miscalculated India's response? Because India so far has chosen not to respond to the belligerence of the United States. There is caution, there is measure in which India has responded.
I think there's no question he miscalculated. It was a huge mistake on his part. He's now created a world in which we, the United States, have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and we're now pushing the Indians into the arms of the Chinese. This is not in America's strategic interest. America should have good relations with Russia, in fact, very good relations with Russia, and America should have very good relations with India. The fact that we don't, and the fact that Trump has greatly contributed to this situation, just shows you that he really doesn't know what he's doing.
Okay, is there a window of negotiation open here? Is there a possibility of some kind of resolution of this crisis?
Well, I think it largely depends on the United States and, in particular, President Trump. And the question you have to ask yourself is President Trump going to realize that he's made a huge blunder here? As you pointed out, I think quite correctly, there's no evidence that India is going to back off. And given that India is not going to back off, and it's not in our interest to see Modi, Xi, and Putin all smiling and shaking hands together, one would surmise that Trump is going to reverse direction and he's going to try to improve relations with India. There have been all sorts of reports here in the United States that President Trump has been trying to call Prime Minister Modi, but he can't get through to Prime Minister Modi. That indicates to me that maybe Trump wants to bury the hatchet, as we say, and restore good relations. I can't say that for certain, but maybe he's trying to do that. I would be surprised if he doesn't try to do that at some point in the near future, because again, it's in our strategic interest. But if he does that, the question then becomes, how will India react? And my sense is that the Indians will not go to great lengths to restore close relations with the United States. I think India now understands that you have to be very careful when you're dealing with the United States, especially when you're dealing with President Trump, and you don't want to get too close to the United States. You don't want to be too dependent on the United States. So my view is that even if President Trump reaches out to Prime Minister Modi, I think Prime Minister Modi, for smart reasons, will keep his distance.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, really appreciate your time. Thank you for speaking to India Today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.